So the last quote that I have for you is from Christopher Carter. He has a book called The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. And he says, eating good old-fashioned soul food is a community event, a time when people feed those who may not be able to feed themselves just because they are a part of our community. And so we really realize here that the speed at which the civil rights movement was able to gain speed and political legitimacy, essentially, was hand in hand with the security of food. And while some people might look at the situation of African Americans during this time and say, oh, well, it's a food desert, it can be more accurately described as a food apartheid because it is not a naturally occurring event, but a socially inflicted and oppressive ideology. So I think that I'm the last speaker, and I don't have any questions prompted for you all, but I'm happy to answer any that anyone might have.
Sorry, everyone, my internet went out, so now I'm joining from my phone. So I'm sorry for the interruptions and with the recording as well. I will open it up to general questions, either between the panel participants or among the audience. And I'm just because my internet is not happy, I'm just going to go ahead and keep my video off for this part as well.
Rachel and Morgan, both very interesting projects. Rachel, I guess I'm curious how or why trust emerged as an essential component of your research. I'm really curious because it's also something that I didn't touch on, but certainly relevant in the work I'm doing as well. So it's cool to see.
I do different forms of community engagement work. I was a teacher for a long time, and when I begin this type of work, I think a lot about care, like how can I enter into a space of care? Is the work I'm doing any harm, and just being self-reflexive in that way. And so when I was thinking about sharing recipes, it seems like a pretty neutral thing to do on the outset, but then when we were also talking about, okay, well, let's also share the stories behind the recipes and the chefs behind the recipes and memorialize this in print, I thought about how that does require more levels of trust and care than just having someone, fill out a form and share a recipe to really build those stories. I was thinking to what Morgan, I'm glad you showed that slide at the end with the hierarchy, because each of us kind of talked about food as an organizing tool in a way, in a positive or possibly negative way where it causes people to want to strike. But I was thinking about how food also facilitates those higher levels of need, of intimacy or of connection. So thank you for showing that.
I think that's a really smart takeaway, just the intimacy of food, because I think it really offers a window into the cultures and the families that you're receiving these from. So I guess I was wondering, did you happen to see any consistencies in the recipes you received? Were they super diverse in nature? Yeah, I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so far we're still in the pretty early stages of the recipes, but the ones that I have received back, there's been a large focus on properly attributing the recipe to the person who they received it from. So no one is really coming into this stamping it this is my recipe and I want it sent forth into the world as mine. It's more so, this is my great grandma's recipe, and she taught me how to make this in our small apartment kitchen when I was 5 years old. So that's been a theme, and so many different recipes as well that really reflect the diverse cultures of over 600 Turner members. Nick, you mentioned that you've kind of thought about trust as well in the work that you do. Could you expand upon that and the ways you think about it?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in other work similar to what I'm looking at doing, and that's considered things like social capital or social cohesion through community gardens, but looking at these ideas critically. um, one of the issues with social capital is it's kind of like a doesn't allow for the change of relationships. So, the basic premise, at least from the perspective that interests me in the idea, is that you can have different levels of kind of social connection. So Putnam uses the idea of social bridges. So these are like more distant connections between people, and then social bonds, closer relationships with people. But he doesn't really kind of articulate, is there ways that people can go from more distant connections to closer connections? And I think that that's possible through urban agriculture and a lot of other processes as well. I think you both have described some of those. And so some of the people who criticize the idea of social capital suggest that trust might be a better term. So I'm looking at that and how trust can be built through those spaces. But then the question is, how like what are representations of trust? So how do we know trust exists? And so digging into that a little bit deeper. And I think it seems like some of your work has spoken to this. Vulnerability is what I've seen as being like a marker of that. And I think that you can, at least for me, I think I can observe vulnerability more easily than trust, because trust is, I think, maybe a higher level order idea than vulnerability. I think we can kind of identify where and when we see vulnerability. So those are, some of the ways I've thought of it. I was going to ask Morgan, are you familiar with Monica White's research? She's has a book that she published recently, and she touches, I think much of her work is focused around Fannie Lou Hamer. Familiar with her because she's here in Madison.
No, I haven't. That sounds really interesting. I found a documentary on Fannie Lou Hamer that I was super stoked about. So I'm excited to hear that there's more material that I can grab onto.
Yeah, highly recommend her work. I can see if I can look up the title of the book.
That'd be great.
I want to always leave space for other voices as well if there's more questions, but I'm always really curious and I love each of the presentations. So I'm sorry if I missed this in the little part that I was out, but I really liked what you, Rachel, had said about the messiness and being mindful of that. And if there was more that you wanted to share on it, or if the other panelists, if you also encountered any sort of messiness in your work or in trust building, I would just be curious if others had responses to that element as well. I think that's a sort of a new thought in the conference this weekend too. We haven't come across that yet.
Yeah, I have a really good example of this with this project and how it can be messy at times is from this project, another idea for a project very similar emerged, which is to talk to Elder Turner members and ask them about their experience within the Turners. And I'm working directly with a documentarian to do that and setting up interviews. And part of that also is asking about food. But it's messy in the sense that this is a priority right now because these Turner members are older and we really want to be able to take what they have to say and make it a part of Turner history. And so community engaged work is very messy, and I would recommend anyone who goes into it to go in with like an open mind and a willingness to come up with creative solutions. And so this project is now taking priority, and the recipe book is kind of on the back burner, which is why I didn't bring a ton of recipes to share today. But the evolution of the project is still really clear, and there's a thread from the two. And I'm excited for, to like be able to help co-create two really important projects for the Turners. So that's one example of messiness I've encountered so far.
Yeah, messiness. I think that's a great point, Rachel, about how community engaged projects, they involve life and it has this twist and its turns. It sounds like your project's taken a really great twist. I think the best example I have is, and I think I spoke to it a bit, is in one of my case studies. I'm really just interested in how policy can support and advance, I think, what I'd say is the already good work that's happening, and to Rachel's point about our own research, but also policy as well, how it can, all the negative aspects of policy can be minimized. So I think that there's some messiness that emerged when people were successful in getting city to want to be involved with urban agriculture. But part of the prompt for my research is that it seems like it didn't necessarily engage in a way that was the most constructive, which isn't to blame any individual actors, because they face a whole lot of constraints from city to the folks that interface with. But yeah, so we're all kind of, I think, generally wanting similar goals, but we have all these different constraints. And so I think that those create messiness. And I guess my naive hope is that maybe some of my research will help to at least create some clarity in that messiness. But certainly I don't think it's going away. And that's probably for the best.
I guess in regard to my own research, a lot of the messiness that I've found hasn't really been like based on community engagement, like my own engagement, but more just like what I have found through my research. I think a lot of times whenever we look at the modern racial, ideologies of today, will say, oh, well, now we know better. Now, like, we know better now than what we used to know back, during Jim Crow, during slavery, et cetera. And the exactifications of all of the evil and wrongdoing that took place by the hand of white supremacy is so obviously calculated that there's no way that it could ever be considered by anyone in any time period, anything beyond just manipulative and oppressive. And so I've seen examples of like Black communities finally receiving a food pantry, and the day before the food pantry opens, police officers sneak into the building and urinate on all of the food. And these are not singular examples. They happened all the time. And whenever you realize that like food programs like food stamps and school meals, those were brought about because of voters. So whenever you think about Fannie Lou Hamer and Ann Moody being part of the path of voter registration, it's because communities received aid based on voter representation. And so if all of the voters are white and saying, oh, we all have enough food, we have enough money, like we're good, they're not going to receive aid. When in actuality, the poor rural Black people of those areas are dying of malnutrition. And so it's been really interesting to dig into it. I've gained a lot of thought and come up with even more questions that I can't wait to like research and look at other activists to find answers to, but it's a lot to take on.
Morgan, I was thinking too, I forget which woman it was. I think it was the first woman you were talking about, Moody, how her eating at the dinner table with white people for the first time, like showed like the messy kind of power relations there too. And then her mom's commentary on that as well shows, again, this like messiness of how people are interacting and being organized around food.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the conceptualization of race understanding took place because of the way that these people interacted with food and around food. And so I appreciate you said that.
Spending like a little bit of time sitting with what you said, because the thing about messiness is that often these topics are also really heavy and deserve attention to the emotions that they bring up in us. I'm really just thinking about that, yeah, this idea that like we say, well, we know better now, but in actuality, those moves were very calculated. And I think that comes back to some of the, for anyone who was able to attend the keynote, what she was saying about these being policy choices, that these systemic issues are on purpose, that these challenges we face are not on accident, and that, yeah, that people did know what they were doing and they were doing it on purpose. And so if anyone wants to take that piece up also, you're welcome to, but I wanted to just bring in a different direction, a question around scale. So as someone who is interested in reproductive justice and care work, I'm always really interested in scale, and what happens on a small scale, and how we scale that to larger institutional and systemic ways, and if that is even what we want to do, if we want to bring things to scale. And so each of your presentations were sort of operating on a different scale, from this very small local program of a cookbook, to Morgan, your more community-based organizing, sort of community by community is a thread that I was hearing throughout. And then Nick, you were talking about that some of this policy work really should be happening on the federal level. And so I'm seeing interconnections between each of those, like sort of through this lens of scale, if any of you wanted to speak to that.
I think in regard to my presentation, I kind of walked away with the understanding that like methodical infrastructural oppression will require an even more vigilantly methodical dismantelization. So like on a scale that looks obviously like, I don't know, changing the system, having to start from the top down, because I think that that's one of the only ways that change will be able to take place. But I don't know what that looks like because it sounds revolutionary. So
Yeah, what I think about with scale is how certain things, like from a urban planning perspective, how certain things kind of need to be at certain scale to work. Um, a bus system, for example, in a city works well when it's one operator. We can think of in the past in our country, we used to have, like in Milwaukee, there used to be multiple different companies operating various streetcar lines. In other countries, I think you still see various actors all kind of operating. And so from that to like utilities, we have these recognition that monopolies are good and because they can operate at these scales for public services. And so I think of food systems and urban agriculture being a different type of entity that doesn't necessarily operate best at that scale. There's a whole host of actors that can and should be a part of these processes. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the balance with any kind of community-led effort is how do you bring it to scale enough for it to have impact, but not disconnect it from the authentic kind of perspective and voices that help to shape it, that gave it meaning. And so I think that that's something that urban agriculture and urban food systems has to offer, because you can reach a lot of people, you can make huge impact by, having a community meal or having a community garden. That's tangible, real impact, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at this grand scale where voices tend to get muted when you bring it to that scale. So some thoughts.
Yeah, I am kind of from the line of thought that the hierarchy that Morgan showed in her presentation, like, will never be provided by the state, and that humans in community with one another will have to guarantee it for themselves. And that change happens within communities. And once communities feel empowered, that has ripple effects. And Amber, what you said about, particularly for reproductive justice, I think about the changes in states that are pretty surprising, or would have been pretty surprising 5 years ago, like Michigan, for example. And a lot of that happened as a result of on the ground community work that then metastasized and became policy level change.
So we are at 3:30, and like I said, I did extend this session just a little bit so that for some closing remarks, which will only take me a few minutes. So I sort of leave it up to our panel participants if we are ready to close out, or if you have more questions and conversation for one another, please feel free to interrupt and continue the conversation in this space.
I'd just say thanks again to you all. Rachel, you left me with a kind of lingering thought that I had to jot some notes down. And Amber, your question about federal policy. So more things to think about for me on my end, but this has been great.
Yeah, thank you both.
All right, so we'll see if my internet connection can handle me turning on the video, and hopefully I don't drop off in these last few minutes again. But thank you, everyone, as we come to the close of our conference, Nourish, Food, and Trust. And at the risk of turning metaphor into pun, I found through each session throughout this conference that I'm left with plenty to chew on. To turn us back to the opening metaphor of our keynote, Dr. Sapana Kure, I'm remembering how she invited us to view our time together as sharing a meal. This meal or conference has felt like a potluck, where we each bring something to share with one another and have an opportunity to sample many dishes in the form of different topics, methodologies, disciplines, as well as cultures and regions. There's been an emphasis this weekend on bringing our humanity to our scholarly work And I want to highlight that our positioning and personal connection to the work can be viewed as an asset in our research rather than a deficit. Our connections to the work help us to recognize its importance and ask critical questions in our field that are deeply informed by our identities. I want to thank everyone who came together to make this conference a success. Thank you to UW-Milwaukee's Center for 21st Century Studies, our partner who sponsored us as a working group this year to make MIGC happen. And especially to our faculty advisor, Nicole, who is the deputy director, and her guidance throughout this process was essential to our success. Additionally, a thank you to my fellow board members to help plan and create this year's conference. And of course, we extend warm gratitude to our keynote speaker for opening and centering the conference on justice and a recognition of the systemic nature of the challenges we face in reimagining our food in decolonial ways. Finally, I want to thank each of our panelists and audience members for sharing your ideas, research, and questions as those rich dishes in our metaphorical potluck. As a conference that encourages critical engagement across disciplines, and as a critical scholar, activist, practitioner myself, I want to center us in a remembering that critical theories seek to not only uncover, understand, or examine societal conditions, but to make positive changes in our communities and in structures and systems. As Suparna invited us to consider not just the table, but the chairs, I want us to reflect again on her question of what chair will you build? By this, she was referring to what our piece of work is in this food and land justice movement, that we each have something to contribute in our own way. And lastly, to close out, as you reflect on this question, I invite you all to remain connected to C21 and to MIGC in the future. Especially for those of you who are connected to UW-Milwaukee, I invite you to consider joining our board to plan next year's conference. And with that, I will give one last Zoom wave to you all and say thank you again for being a part of MIGC, our 18th annual Midwest Interdisciplinary Graduate Conference. Thank you.